It's 4 o'clock in Los Angeles. It's 6 o'clock in Chicago. And it's 7 p.m. in New York City. Hello, everybody. I'm Mad Dog the Scipio, joined as I am each and every week, God help me, by Amelia the Pitbull Chapman. How are you, Amelia?
Doing great. How are you?
I'm fine. I was going to say, Amelia, you muted yourself.
We have thunder and lightning here. I apologize.
Oh, you've got some nasty weather. Okay. We have, well, how you doing, kid?
I'm doing good. Good.
You all right?
Yeah.
You're going to make it through the show, or you're going to bail out on me?
No, I'm doing good. I'm just still.
All right. Terrific. We have a very good show tonight. A returning guest is joining us, this time for a very different subject matter, one that I would venture to say, Mike Lynch, that tonight's show will be controversial on some level, enlightening on many levels, and certainly a lightning rod, no matter what position you take.
Right.
Let me introduce my guest. His name, I'll bring up on the big camera here, Mike.
Hello.
Gonna make you a star tonight.
Yeah.
This is, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Mike Lynch. Mike is a returning guest. He was on the show when we did our Escape from Alcatraz show. His co-authored the book Alcatraz: The Last Escape with and I forgot already your co-writer's name on that.
Ken Widener.
Ken, that's it.
That's it.
Ken is a relative of the Alcatraz 3, or the Alcatraz 2 anyway, for sure.
Yeah.
But you are here tonight for a very different cause and purpose. Let me tell everybody how this came about. It's interesting. Mike is very perceptive in some regards. I got an email after the Alcatraz show. And it's funny because just right off the cuff and out of the chute, Mike writes, "You seem like a man of faith." And I went, "Oh shit, boy, I'm in trouble." So and I am, by the way. I'm a little rough around the edges, but I think God likes me that way. And so I thought, you know what? This is a really interesting cat. This is an interesting guy to have on the show. And when I mentioned to Mike that we're doing the program on who wrote the Bible and is there a God and is Jesus a real person over the next couple of nights, he did not hesitate but to say, yes, of course, count me in. So welcome, my friend. Welcome back to the Mad Dog and the Pitbull.
Welcome.
Good to be here. Good to be here. I've been looking forward to this.
I am too. I don't know where it's going to take us, but like I always tell God, let the Spirit move and take us where you want. And He always does.
Yes, he does.
Not always where we want to go, though, but always where we need to be. That's the important thing. Let me just tell everyone why we're here. Tonight's show, who really wrote the Bible? We know little to nothing, really, other than we know for sure the first 5 books were written by Moses. We know that for sure, because we have the manuscripts to prove it. Other than that, it's a crapshoot, Mike. It kind of is a crapshoot. We really don't know who wrote the Bible in earnest. But let me tell everybody a little bit about what we do know. As the sacred text for 2 of the world's leading religions, Judaism and Christianity, as well as others, by the way, the Bible has, and listen to this carefully, folks, the Bible has an unmatched influence on literature, population, and lifestyle, particularly in the Western world. It has been translated into nearly 700 languages, and while exact figures are hard to come by as far as sales figures, while that is hard to come by, it's widely believed and considered to be the best-selling book in the world, with sales numbers in the hundreds of millions of dollars and maybe possibly billions of dollars. Despite the Bible's undeniable influence, mysteries continue to linger over its origins. Even here, now, after 2,000 years of existence and centuries of investigation, we still do not know with certainty who wrote its various texts, when they were written, or under what circumstances. And that, my friends, is the subject and topic of tonight's show. Who wrote the Bible? When did it happen? Were there multiple authors? Was there one guy that wrote the whole thing? Believe it or not, Mike, some people say, yeah. Some
Sure.
people say
Yeah.
one guy wrote the whole thing.
Well, I think that's easy to disprove, but we can get into that.
Well, there's no time like the present, brother. Let's get into it right now.
Okay,
So
well,
here's
I do agree with you that the Bible is probably the most influential book that has ever been written. I'm not to deny the Quran and other religious teachings in different parts of the world,
Yeah.
but the Bible goes back to the mid 1400 BCs when Moses wrote the first 5 books. There are a number of passages in the books that talk about God telling Moses to write these things down. As God gave Moses the law, he said, write this down so that this will be remembered and not forgotten. There are numerous passages that discuss this. And for those who claim, well, Moses was, illiterate, he couldn't read or write, how could Moses do this? What they also forget is in the early part of the book of Exodus, Moses was raised in, as it was called, Pharaoh's household.
yes.
We know the story. If you've seen the 10 Commandments with Charlton Heston, they tell the story of, that the king, or the Pharaoh, excuse me, decreed that the males were to be killed, the children males, because they were becoming too populous. He was worried about an uprising. And so the male children are murdered, except the mother of Moses hid him for several months until he became too big or too loud, noisy to be hidden. So she puts him in the water, and then the sister follows him, in a little reed basket, and the Pharaoh's daughter finds him in the Nile, and then brings him into the household. And so for the next 40 years, he's raised an educated man. He could read and write. He understood literature. He understood history.
Sure.
He was a very intelligent person. So he was well qualified for the job when God comes to him and says, okay, start writing everything down because I want these things to be remembered. And then we have the first 5 books of the Bible.
Yeah. And therein, the controversy begins. As I said at the outset of the show, there's no dispute that for fact, for certainty, and for posterity, we know factually Moses did, in fact, write the first 5 books. That's without dispute now. We know that based on the history, based on the theology, and here's a surprise, we know that based on the science. One of the things that science did early on was try to dispute the history of the Bible and the existence of God or Jesus. Now we find something interesting happening. Science is actually proving these things to be true, which is kind of like the shoes on the other foot now, Mike. We know for a fact that, as I said, Moses wrote the first 5, but now beyond that, that's where it kind of gets murky. That's where the quagmire starts to unfold. Can we say with certainty that the Bible as we know it today, in its King James form, because that is the closest to the original text that we know, do we know whether the Bible today, Mike, we can categorically say was written by a limited number of authors, 1 or 2?
So the book, when we'll just say Old Testament, New Testament, because if you come from a Jewish background, or anyone who comes from a Jewish background, they would not refer to what typically the Christian perspective, the Old Testament. They would call it the Hebrew Bible.
Yes.
And then for them, of course, the God's revelation stops in the last book, which is the book of Malachi.
Yeah.
He's a minor prophet. And then there's what's known as the 400 years of silence, when God doesn't speak or there's no new revelation. And then we get into the New Testament, of course, when Jesus appears, and then what happens with the birth of the church and the various epistles and letters that were written after that. But I'm just going to, just for reference sake, I'm just going to say Old Testament, New Testament. So there are approximately, there are 66 books in the Bible, and there are generally considered to be approximately 40 authors of those books. And you have to remember that Moses was around 1450 BC, thereabouts.
Right.
And the Old Testament is written until about 400 BC, like I said, with the book of Malachi.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you go to, we'll just say near year zero, when Jesus arrives, he starts his ministry approximately 30 AD, thereabouts.
Yeah.
And the canon closes for the New Testament around the year 90, 95.
Yeah.
So you have a total revelation of approximately 1,500 years, give or take a decade.
Interesting. The in recent years, there have been a number of people that put forward theories. We will talk about two of them tonight: the single author theory and the various schools of authors theory. Let me just take and much of this is just validation and verification of what Mike said. The single author theory was believed to be Moses, the Hebrew prophet who led the Israelites out of captivity in Egypt and guided them across the Red Sea toward the Promised Land. Yet, nearly from the beginning, readers of the Bible observed that there were things in the so-called 5 books of Moses that Moses himself could not possibly have witnessed. His own death, for example, occurs near the end of Deuteronomy. A volume of the Talmud, the collection of Jewish laws recorded between 3 and 5 centuries AD, dealt with the inconsistency in explaining that Joshua, Moses' successor as leader of the Israelites, likely wrote the verses about Moses' death. Your thoughts on that, Mike, and have you heard that? Are you familiar with this?
Yeah, that's a common argument against Moses writing the first 5 books of the Bible, because, as you said, in Deuteronomy, the 5th book, the end of the book records the death of Moses. So, of course, how could Moses have written his own death unless he was, a really significant prophet?
Yeah, right.
So
Exactly.
So generally, it's believed that somebody, nobody knows, but Joshua's a likely person, because he was, as Moses was leading the 12 tribes through the 40 years in the desert. Joshua was his general, he was his leader, he was Moses' right-hand man. So he had very close access to Moses for many, many years. He was actually, not a lot of people know this, but when Israel, or the children of Israel, after they're released from slavery in Egypt, they make it, to the Red Sea.
Right.
And they're about to enter the Promised Land. But before they do, Moses sends in the 12 spies to kind of check out the land, see what it's like.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those spies was actually Joshua.
Interesting.
Yeah, so he was one of the, and then the other one was Caleb. Caleb and Joshua were 2 of the 12, and when they come back to report to Moses, okay, what did you see? 10 of the spies said, yeah, it's a great land, but there's these giants there. We're insects compared to them. They're too powerful. They're too strong. We can't survive. So let's go back. Let's go back to Egypt, where it was really pretty good. Slavery wasn't really that bad. And Caleb and Joshua were the only 2 that said, no. God's going to give us the land. Let's go right now. And and so, because the people disobeyed God, he said, because you didn't believe in me, you didn't trust in me, you're going to wander in the desert for 40 years until you die. The not all the people died. It was the adult generation, the adult, 20 and above. And the only 2 God said that are going to make it are Joshua and Caleb. And that's exactly what happened.
Interesting stuff. I think, just on forget about the spiritual aspect of it for a moment. Forget about the historical aspect of it for a moment. Just from a nuts and bolts, common sense, roll up your sleeve point of view, you would almost have to assume the position that a number of people wrote the Bible just based on the number of different writing styles, the languages used, the locations, the time frame is a huge aspect of why many people believe that it could not have possibly been one single author. And first of all, I don't think there's any one person who could have written such a book, not the way it's laid out. There's just way too much in it. And by the way, Mike, a lot of time that passes by from one thing to another, even from one chapter to another in a lot of these books. Sometimes you're talking about hundreds of years passing between chapters. That's not an insignificant, factor to take into consideration. When you consider that, we all have, and I hate to say this, but we all have an expiration date. I hate to use that term,
Right.
but we don't live, exponentially forever, not physically anyway. So there's no way. I don't think there's any possible way we can even consider that Moses wrote this. All of it anyway, for sure.
Yes. Yeah, like I said, Moses comes around 1450 BC, and the last book is written around 400. So it's a 1,000-year period of Jewish history that is covered.
Yeah.
And there are references, there are documents that go back into the 700s, before the Old Testament was completed. So it's not possible for one person to have written everything when you're referring to things that are older than you that haven't been done yet.
True.
It's just not possible. So,
it really is. It's given me food for thought. One of the reasons I wanted to do this show is from time to time I have a crisis of faith and go into the Bible and look for things to validate myself or my faith. And I find contradictory material. I go, oh, this is not good. This is not good.
Yeah, and then he's like, oh, he gets a light and he says, I want to do this. Is that why it said that there was 14 books either not used or removed from the Bible?
Now, are you talking about, because there's the Catholic Bible, and then there are certain books that the Catholic Bible has that were written during the BC period.
The Apocrypha.
Right, the apocryphal books that are not in what you would call more of a Protestant flavored Bible.
True.
Yes.
Now that came about after Martin Luther. I mean, these books have been around for, like I said, in the BC period. One of them talks about in 167 AD BC. There was a Jewish uprising. You have the Maccabee family. That's where we get, where they have the, I'm drawing a blank here. It's where they have the festival, the 8 days. That took place during the Maccabean revolt, when they run, they only had oil for 1 day, and it, miraculously lasts 8 days, and so they celebrate that. So when Martin Luther appears on the scene in the early 1500s and breaks away from the Catholic Church and doesn't agree with the Pope anymore, as far as what is the source of her inspiration? Is it the Bible / Holy Spirit, or is it the Pope? That's where the dividing line came from Martin Luther, to differentiate itself from the Protestantism that was building up in Europe at the time. That's when the Catholic Church added the apocryphal books to sort of to reinforce their theological positions as a Catholic Church. So that is a more recent addition to the Bible than an older addition.
Mike, I got a question for you. You're familiar, of course, with the Epic of Gilgamesh.
I know some elements of it. Yes, it has the flood story in it. That's famously brought out.
There are a number of, and I mean a number. I'm talking about, in some cases, verbatim, the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Holy Bible. What do you make of the almost identical timeline from Gilgamesh to the Bible, they almost parallel each other, despite the fact that Gilgamesh was written 500 to 700 years before the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
How do you reconcile the stories being the same, using words like Messiah, using words like the chosen one, referring to an evil adversary, talking about a one true God? We're talking about two books that were divergent in time, but yet they talk about almost colloquially almost identical topics, subject matter, even in some cases, Mike, mentioning the same names. How do you reconcile that? How do we do that?
I'll answer it two ways. The first is, as we've talked about, the Bible was written, 1400 years before Jesus was born.
Right.
Well, the time frame for the Bible goes back really thousands of years before, we have our recorded history of these events.
Exactly.
And so obviously, because reading and writing wasn't invented until the Sumerian time around 5,000, 6,000 BC. That's when writing was really starting. As society was becoming more complex, you needed a recording system, and so writing was developed. But most.
And Mike, while you're on that, Mike, Amelia has a pointed question in regards to that and the style of writing and the instrumentation. Amelia, want to ask Mike what you were talking about before we went on there?
Oh, you mean like where it was written on, the type of paper?
Yeah.
Well, it wasn't paper. It was in cuneiform. It was on little clay tablets in the Middle East. Paper was invented in China around, I think, 2000 BC, I believe. I'm not 100% sure, but paper was a Chinese invention. Well, Chinese and also Egyptian, because they had papyrus. That's actually where we get our word for paper, papyrus. So, but in the Middle East, it was clay tablets.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what is your question?
I'm sorry to interrupt. No, she wanted to know. She asked me. I said, I don't know. I'm going to ask Mike.
Because because in the Middle East they have mud and water and they have sticks, and they were just using the resource that they had available, whereas the Egyptians had they had the reeds.
I guess what she was really asking me was, how did they keep records? How did they document? I really don't know.
To keep
I
them
said,
good
when
condition.
Mike gets here, let's ask him.
Yeah, to keep them in good condition.
They had their own libraries in the cities, in Sumer and other areas of that region in the Middle East, or what we would call the Near East in some cases. And they, through archaeological digs, they found thousands of these little clay tablets. They're about maybe this big, and they used a little stylus to use it to write with. And these records have been decoded, have been deciphered, and they can read them. A lot of them are just ordinary record keeping, brains and who owes money and when the next delivery is going to be. But others are prayers to certain gods. Others are poetry. They're people. What do we write about? We write about the important things of our lives. Well, they would find these things in the library, and they have found thousands and thousands and thousands of these little clay tablets. You can go online and see them. They're quite interesting. But what I was going to say before was, even though reading and writing had been invented, we'll say 9,000 or 7,000 years ago, approximately. For 99% of humanity, they're illiterate. The people who had an education were surrounded around the monarchies, the royal lines. You had a king, you had governors of regions. They had to keep records. The scribes and the religious people would need to be educated. They can read and write, but the regular person, the regular people, they were illiterate. And so the way that they communicated information was through stories or through recitation of important events that had happened in the past. And that's how they got their information. And so
Right.
when you talked about the Epic of Gilgamesh and how it parallels very strongly elements of the older books of the Bible, the earliest books of the Bible, especially in the book of Genesis, it's
Right.
not surprising to me, because you've had these stories passed on from one generation to another for thousands of years.
Yeah.
And so there are bound to be strong similarities in some areas, but also they're going to diverge. They're going to be different in other areas. And so there are some very strong dissimilarities in these stories. But
Yeah.
like I said, I mentioned the deluge, the flood story. Well, they're in both the Bible and the Epic of Gilgamesh, and many different cultures around the world, they have flood stories as well. So
Yeah.
these stories have been passed on for thousands and thousands of years, so that you would expect it to be that way.
I think we have to have this discussion. It's important we do, because it ties into the larger question that we'll address tomorrow with Mike, which is there a God? Was Jesus a real person? As we said earlier, science has come a long way in not only validating the Bible, but validating possibly the existence of God and Jesus. But there are two sides to this coin, and we're going to hear both of them. That's why I felt it was critical, Mike, that we have this discussion on the Bible first, because people call this, as you well know, they call this the inspired word of God. And this gets into the whole question of God, which I'm sure we'll delve into that at some point tonight. But I really want to save that discussion for tomorrow.
Sure.
Because we have at least one more night. I would love to get Mike Lynch for another night. Believe it or not, I'd love to have you for 3 nights this week if I could. Because Wednesday would be like the show to really get into. The question of whether there were multiple authors. Well, here's what I am told about that. To explain the Bible's contradictions, repetitions, and general idiosyncrasies, most scholars today agree that the stories and laws it contains were communicated orally through prose and poetry over centuries in time. Starting around the 7th century BC, different groups of schools, authors wrote them down different times, different places. Location's a big thing too, Mike. Location's a huge component to the whole Bible story. And before they were at some point, probably during the 1st century BC, combined into a single multi-layered work that we know today, it started somewhere. The Bible started somewhere. And I think we can all agree that it had at least multiple authors.
Clearly, yeah, it had to.
Yes,
I
of
never
course.
subscribed to the single author theory. It
Yeah.
had to have different authors. Because,
Yeah.
like I said, it was written over a period of 1,000 years, and it's not just a longevity question. It's also the source material. You have people from different backgrounds writing the Bible. It's not just
Exactly.
like you have King David who wrote the Psalms.
Yeah.
You had, Moses, who, I mean, yes, he was a prince of Egypt, but he was also a shepherd for 40 years. He was a very humble man who lived a very simple life, the second half of his life before God, called him through the burning bush and to lead the children out of Israel.
Yeah.
Joshua was a general leader. David, yes, he was a king. Well, he didn't start off as a king. He also started off as a shepherd. He was just a simple shepherd who came from a humble family.
Yeah.
You had, some of the prophets who were, some of them were monastic. They lived, kind of out in the wilderness areas. One of them was a fig farmer, just to name a few different things. And one of the things that you also made reference to was location, how that's important. And that's exceptionally important because, the Bible was written by eyewitnesses. They saw events like, for example, the book of Lamentations was written by the prophet Jeremiah. Well, he's writing about when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem in 586 BC. They came in, conquered the country, burned the city, burned the temple, and most of the people are led into captivity back into Babylon. Well, Jeremiah was prophesying beforehand, telling the people, if you don't repent of your sins, because they had fallen into idolatry, they were worshiping Baal and other local deities, and God had told them not to. They kept doing it, and God says, if you don't repent and turn from these practices that I've not approved, I'm going to send a conqueror. And that's exactly what happened. So he writes in the book of Lamentations, literally looking at the burned out city and just crying. That's what the whole book is about. It's just the loss of a nation and a people and a culture. Well, he was an eyewitness, and he wrote about his experience. And so in many of the books reference battles, locations, cities, towns, historical events. And you can go to other historical records outside the Bible and corroborate this information. And it says, like you said, it says essentially the same thing. And in history, the standard of history to document something as authentic or actually have a factual event of happening is have two independent sources saying the same thing. That is the standard history uses.
Mike, we will take a short commercial break from our sponsors. Take a listen to this, folks, and take care of my people at Shopify.
Jess wanted to start a business when something surprising happened.
Today, I'm going to teach you how to crochet.
She started crocheting, like a lot. And her friends noticed.
Jess, you need to sell those.
So she signed up for Shopify and started building her business.
Yes, I love that.
And after a lot of hard work, this happened.
Oh my gosh, I just made my first sale!
You see, every day, hundreds of businesses get their first sale on Shopify.
We got ding!
And the next could be you. So when you're ready to bring your idea to life
And become your own boss.
build it on Shopify.
What's the Buzz Popcast is back with Mike Lynch. And this is an interesting discussion. I'm really enjoying this, believe it or not. I really am. I love these kind of talks. Mike, let's get into the question of, we may as well broach it now. Let's get into the God question. This book we call The Bible was written based on what many people believe was divine inspiration from, quote, the heavens above, unquote. I don't even know like how to start this question off, because I'm going to sound like, a disgruntled, Christian here. I'm really not. Where did they get their inspiration for what they called God, or who they called God?
Well,
what do we know about this God?
Well, I'm going to read a verse to you. It's a very short verse in the Bible that answers that indirectly, and then I'll answer it directly. It's in 2
Any
Peter
way
1,
you want, brother.
2 Peter 1:21, and it says, "For no prophecy was ever made by an act of the human will, but men moved by the Holy Spirit, spoken from God." So the Bible says of itself that it wasn't people who decided, I think I'm going to write this information down, or this experience down, or this event down. It was Peter, who was one of Jesus's apostles, said that it's the Holy Spirit, which the Bible claims is God, because God is triune. It's God. It's one God, three personalities: Father, Son, Holy Spirit.
Right.
That in the Spirit of God is God, just the third part of the Trinity. That he moved in men's hearts to write something down in a way that God had desired, his words, his ideas.
But Mike, at some point, there has to be that one person. All of this started with one. Okay.
So if you go to the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, the first line of the book, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
Right.
So
I reiterate, who or what is God? First of all, who came up with the name God? Where did we get God from? My understanding is that God actually has a name that we're not supposed to speak it.
Well,
You know?
Moses at the burning bush, when God reveals himself to the burning bush, Moses asks him, "What is your name?" Because he's going to go to the people of Egypt.
Yeah.
And he says, they're going to ask me what God's name is, because they didn't know. They just sort of
Yeah.
use, like we say, we'll just say God. It's just sort of a generic reference to a supreme being. That
Yeah,
God is not God's
exactly.
name. And God said, my name is Yahweh, which means I am that I am.
I am that I am.
That's what Yahweh means. And God said,
And what
that's
the
my
hell
name.
does that mean? Like, explain this to me.
Well,
Explain this to me. I get it. Jesus even said, when Pontius Pilate asked him, are you he? And he said, I am.
I am Yahweh.
I
Yes.
am. So
And
what, give me this whole I am thing can be very convoluted.
well, when we understand, we are finite beings, we're people, we have limitations. And
Right.
most people concept of God is that he is infinite and holy,
I totally get
beyond
that.
understanding. And so if God gave a name to himself that says, oh, I know exactly who God is, I completely understand who he is,
Yeah.
then that's not God, because that is not something we can comprehend. But if he has a name like my name is I am, it's almost like saying my name is being. I exist.
Yeah.
That is my name. We don't know what that means. We don't understand it.
Well, the fact that Moses audibly heard the voice of God say, my name is Yahweh, I am that I am.
Yes.
It's either Moses was the most blessed individual in the Bible, or he was one lucky son of a gun because he got to hang out with God for a bit. He even turned his hair
God did
white.
that with a number of people. The next probably most famous person he did that with is Abraham. Abraham was called a friend of God, that they had a friendship with each other.
And not only that, and I have to ask you, Mike, because this is one, and it's only happens one time in the Bible, only one time. And here's the line, and you'll know exactly what I tell you. And Enoch walked with God.
Mm-hmm.
Tell everyone who Enoch was and why was he so beloved by God?
Well, he walked with God, and then he wasn't. Then he was gone. He was. There are two people in the Old Testament who disappeared. They just
like that, Mike. Poof.
Right. Just he was there and then he was gone. And the same thing with Elijah. Elijah was the same thing, except he was brought up. He had a servant named Elisha, similar names, and he was brought up with a kind of like a fiery chariot, brought up into heaven. One would assume. So there are two people that did not die.
Yeah.
And one of them was Enoch.
Interesting. So they eluded death.
So far. Now it's interesting.
Okay, hold up. Back up there, brother. Back up. Hold on. You had me, and then you got me with the so far. Okay, I got a question for you, baby. I got a question for you. What do you mean so far? It's been a long time. Obviously, Enoch and Elijah, those and Abraham, those cats were a long time ago.
Yes.
Okay. We're a long way removed from that.
Yes.
Okay. So are you telling me that maybe they're still hanging out, or
no? That's not what I'm saying. Yeah.
Okay.
The Bible makes gives the picture that when they were taken up to heaven without experiencing death.
I got you. Okay.
Now let's jump to the New Testament, book of Revelation. And I'm not going to go deep in Revelation, so don't worry about that. So in Revelation,
I'm not concerned about that. I know Revelations.
So it talks about the rapture. And I know that's very controversial. There's a lot of different ideas about it, but the general idea is that, Jesus said he promised to come back, his second coming. And it says that for those who are still alive when he comes back, they're going to rise up and meet Jesus in the air, according to Revelation. So they're not going to experience physical death. They're going to immediately be
Okay, so
Connected
here
to
is
him.
my understanding of that, Mike, and you and I have to have this dialogue. All right, here's my understanding. Those that are dead in the flesh will rise first and meet Christ in the air.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
Okay. What about those that are physically living?
They will be. Paul talks about being transformed. That in the twinkling of an eye, we will be made like him, like Christ, in his glorified state.
Okay. Now, let's also understand something. The people will fight you on this word. At no time, anywhere in Scripture, is the word rapture. You'll never find it in the Bible. The Bible, on the other hand, talks about Jesus taking up his church.
Mhm.
Okay, and that's the translation in the King James, to be taken up
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
Christ. Okay, explain to me and everyone watching and listening, because there are a number of people, quite a few, in fact. Where did we get the word rapture? Why does that have this? It has this firebrand effect.
Right.
That it's a lightning rod, Mike. And people go crazy when you say rapture.
Yeah, you are correct. In 1 Thessalonians 4:17, it's translated caught up, and it says that the Latin translation
Caught up, yeah. Mm-hmm.
used the word rapturo. The Greek word it translates is harpazo, which means to snatch or take away. So it's just it's a transliteration of the word.
Okay.
Just like the word baptize, it's the word baptizo. I think it's baptismo. It just
Right.
so we, instead of defining the word, we just transliteration of it into English. That's all it is.
Okay. And it's important because, like I said, Mike, and you know this to be factual, people will argue with you. They'll fight you on minuscule words. You take one, especially to a Bible literalist, they will fight you tooth and nail on the literal meaning of a single word. Forget about phrases. One word will get you in trouble.
Sure, of course.
That's my next question. And Neil, you feel free to jump in here.
Sure.
Talking about the literal translation of the Bible, the literal meaning of the Bible, the literal manifestation of God's word. Okay. Is there any way to validate the literacy, if I could use that word, the literacy of the Bible? Is it a literal from God's mouth to our ears? Because there are a number of people, and you know this to be true as well, Mike, and I'm not pointing anything out that's not true. You know, there are a number of people who believe the Bible to be literal, that you have to take it literally in order to go to heaven, in order to see God. You have to take the Bible literally. Despite the fact, Mike Lynch, that there are theologians who will tell you if you try to live the life of the Bible literally, you will either A, end up in a padded room, or you'll kill yourself. You can't, I don't think you possibly could live that literally without making you or the people around you nuts. Please explain to me. What are we
you also have to
talking
remember
about
too, and we haven't talked about this part of the Bible just in general, is that the
Mhm.
Bible is different styles of literature. So, for example, you have the book of First Chronicles, Second Chronicles, First Samuel, Second Samuel in the Old Testament.
Right.
Well, those are historical books. They're chronicling kings, events, battles, places, conversations. It's just
Yeah.
it's like reading a book. It's that's all it is. It's just recording what happened in a hopefully factual way.
Yeah.
But then you have the book of Psalms that David wrote about half the Psalms, and then other various writers wrote the. Well, that's poetic language. That's heart language, and when you use heart language, it's not literal, but you use metaphor. You use comparisons of things to communicate thoughts or to feelings and emotions.
Yeah.
Jesus used this many times in parables. He says the kingdom of heaven is like. And then he'll use a comparison. It's like a wheat field. It's like a pearl. It's like this or it's like that.
I loved Jesus' parables. I loved how eloquently simple and effective the parables were and still are.
Right.
Yeah.
And so
I'm a huge fan of the parables.
If he says that it's like a field where you find a great treasure in a field, well, he's not saying, okay, go find a field and that's heaven. We know that's not literally true. And so you don't take it literally. You take it as an example using nature to make a point about what heaven is like that we can understand. Or another time when Jesus would say, if your eye causes you to sin, what does he say to do to your eye? He says, pluck it out. Or if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off. Well, if you take the Bible literally, you're going to see a lot of one-handed blind people walking around.
Yeah.
Well, we know intuitively he doesn't literally mean that. He means if there's something in your life that's a struggle for you, that's coming between you and God, he's saying remove that thing from your life so that you have a clear path to God. He's using this example, but not literally true. So when people say, "Do you take the Bible literally?" It's like, well, no, I don't, because the Bible isn't meant to be taken literally in some parts. Some parts yes, some parts no.
Well, yeah, and that's that. Oh, go ahead, Amelia.
Oh no, because I've seen it to where they follow the Bible so badly that a husband and wife can brainwash their children so badly to where they've either chained them up if they're not doing it right, something correctly, or they've beaten them so badly to where they've chained them up or not eaten for days, or they treat them so bad. I mean, I've seen movies about this, like true stories, and that's
they're horrible, awful stories that you're taking things out of context. You're not understanding the point of these the teachings of the Bible, and most people are guilty of that. Like you were saying in the beginning, it's so big, it's so complicated. There's so much of it that no one can truly understand it. We're always going to be in error in some way or another. But like you said, some people take it to the extreme and they do horrible things that were never meant to happen.
Yes.
Well, let's continue that. One of the things that I have, first of all, this is a great conversation. Anytime I can get Mike Lynch here is a good occasion because he's the smartest guy I know next to me, and not saying something. No, I like you, Mike. I do. I like you. I'd like to have you here every night if I could. Let's have a serious discussion here. One of the things the Bible, first of all, people don't understand, and let's just clarify this. The Bible is all at once one of the most uplifting books in the world. It's also one of the scariest books in the world if you read it right. It talks about love, hate, murder, incest. It talks about infidelity. It talks about how to raise your children, loving your wife, how to love your wife, when to walk away from your wife or your husband or your spouse. It talks about all of these things. It also talks about damnation and hell, but it also talks about glory in heaven. There's a lot of stuff going on in this book, Mike. My question to you: there has to be more than the 66 books that are in there. I happen to have not only a King James book with the 66, but I also have the Catholic Apocrypha that has the additional books. And I have some other books that were not included in the Bible, like the book of Judas and the book of Mary.
The Gospel of Thomas. That's probably the most famous New Testament book.
The Gospel of Thomas, yeah, absolutely. And there are a number of them, and I have them. But here's the thing: why are they less important in telling the entire chronological story than the 66 that are there. My question is not without merit, I don't think, because if you read, and you and I spoke about it at the beginning of the show, talking about the idiosyncrasies, the inconsistencies, the hypocrisies, and that's just in the first 5. And there's a whole bunch more after that. There's 61 more after that. That in many ways kind of repeat that. And certain stories just stop and others pick up. Or you go, okay, well, it's like watching a movie that all of a sudden it stops and then the credits roll. Wait, what the heck happened here?
Yeah.
You know, what happened here? It's like, it's where to go. So let's talk about. We have to have this discussion. It's important. The books of the Bible. There's got to be more. There have to be.
Well, it's hard to answer that question. So
I'm sorry.
my belief is this. This is what I believe. That God is real. God exists. God created humanity. God created the universe. I mean, that's talked about obviously in the early chapters of the book of Genesis. That God is the uncreated creation. Because like I said, when you go to the first line, it's in the beginning, God was already there. Before there was a beginning, there is God. So how does God exist? We don't know. We don't understand it. It makes no sense to us, but there he is. And he creates the universe. He creates time, space, gravity, physics, chemistry, all the things that we need to survive as a people.
Right.
And so he spends time with Adam and Eve in the garden. He spends time with Moses. He spends time with Abraham. He's a social being. He wants to be with us. It's like parents, why do parents have children? Because they want to have a relationship with something that's a part of themselves. And then, the line continues and then they have children. There's just something within us that wants to pass on our stories, our culture, our DNA, down the line. And I think that comes from God, that is who God is. He wants to have a relationship with us. That's why he created us. And to make sure that we understand the kind of relationship that he wants and who he is. And, God describes himself in some ways. He inspires people to write things down so that we'll never forget them. Oftentimes, again, when we go back to Moses, if a battle took place or if God did something supernatural, he'd say, build an altar here, or pile some rocks here, so that when your son comes and says, hey, Dad, why is that pile of rocks there? Well, let me tell you what God did. So we wouldn't forget, or the laws, write down the laws so you don't forget the laws. And so God communicated his truths to us in certain books that we would call the Bible. And then other books were written that claimed to be inspired, but were not included because they were deemed non-authentic or coming from God or spirit inspired. They weren't considered to be from God, but just human ingenuity or human intelligence. And that's why they were ultimately rejected.
Many years ago, a long time ago, Mike, before you and I were ever thought of, there was a guy named Pope Constantine, and he gathered a group of people at the Council of Nicaea.
Yes.
And that's where they came up with the idea of putting these books together.
Well, that had actually been going on before that. It was starting in around the 2nd, 3rd century of the church's existence. Now, this is before the Council of Nicaea, which was in 325.
Okay.
The church had already started collecting books, because there were different in Europe. There were different schools of thought. There was one in Rome. There was one in Alexandria. There was another one in Jerusalem, of course.
Right.
There were different centers of learning for the New Testament, for the church.
Yeah.
And there were different theological flavors that were permeating based on, who was the bishop of a city, or, if there was a school, there was sort of like a study learning area, what were they teaching?
Yeah.
And so when Constantine became emperor in around 316 AD, right. He was a pagan. He was a Roman emperor, and he he converts to Christianity, but that comes later in his life.
Yes.
He sees, because at that time it's believed that Christianity was about 10% of the Roman Empire, 10% of the population were Christians. The rest of them were they worship the Roman gods and Greek gods. And he starts to see the benefits of Christianity, and he starts to align himself with Christians. And so when he brings the Council of Nicaea in 325, he brings all the leading bishops. There's around 100 or so of them, or maybe it's 200, to come up with what was later became what was called the Apostles' Creed. That is recited, primarily in the Catholic Church, but other denominations have the creed as well. There might be variations of it. Well, the other thing that they also wanted to formalize was for the New Testament, that the Old Testament had been pretty much accepted as done, finished. They weren't going to add any new books, and no books were going to be added. But for the New Testament, it was still a work in progress. And so they had a number of criteria to determine what was considered inspired and what was considered not inspired. So, for example, I talked about the Gospel of Thomas. We have 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are included in the New Testament.
We're going to talk about them at some length after the commercial, but go ahead.
Yeah, but Gospel of Thomas was written in the 200s, was rejected because it was known as a Gnostic gospel. A Gnostic is where we get our word knowledge, or Gnosticism.
Yep.
And that was sort of like, there were like secret societies, where they had these special, beliefs, chants, practices, very secretive, kind of like a Freemason today, kind of similar to that kind of an idea. Yeah. And a lot of the Gnostic beliefs the main one was that Jesus was not a physical person. He didn't actually come in flesh. He came in spirit. He just appeared to be a human being. Yeah. And the reason that's important is because in traditional Christian thought, that Jesus was killed. He died on the cross because he was a person. He was incarnate in the flesh, and he died and then rose again and conquered sin and death. That's the traditional Christian belief. Well, if he was really spirit and he really didn't die, then that really challenges modern Christian thinking. And so the Gospel of Thomas is of that flavor. So that's why it was rejected, because of the flesh issue.
Well, we're going to get in, and I'm glad that you brought that up tonight as a precursor, because we're going to get into that tomorrow about, who Jesus was. Was Jesus a real person, or was Jesus an alchemy of other individuals to create this? Then it's it's a mess, believe me, but there's a movement going on right now, and it's got some legs, Mike. I'll be honest with you. It's got a lot of motion behind it, that there are people who do not believe that Jesus was a real person. They believe he was an alchemy of several individuals, largely emperors of the time, or leaders of the time. We'll talk about that. I happen to believe Jesus was real. I happen to believe that he died on the cross and rose from the dead. I happen to believe all that. That's just me. But we will talk more with Mike Lynch right after this. I have to do this. Mike, I'm so sorry for the commercial I have to play.
That's
but
okay.
You can hold your ears. Amelia happens to love this commercial.
No, I don't.
Do you have sweaty balls or volleyball netty balls? It's time to make them ready balls. The Manscaped.com Lawnmower 3.0 will do the job and clean your knob with its patented no-nick head, so your head will function as desired. Enter promo code Wrestling Future for a generous 20% discount. That's enter Wrestling Future for a 20% discount. Manscaped.com and Wrestling with the Future, going balls to the walls with Manscaped.com. And the Lawnmower 3.0, your balls will thank you. And so will we. What's the Buzz? America's Best Podcast is back on the air on the WWTF broadcast radio system. I am Mad Dog DeCipio. She is Pitbull Chapman. That's Mike Lynch, my buddy. And we are back talking about, we got some serious stuff to talk about too. Real serious stuff. Mike, one of the biggest contentions when you're talking about who wrote the Bible, a large point of contention is who wrote the Gospels. Um, there are people, again, the literalists who believe that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John actually wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and historical evidence to prove that they couldn't possibly have because they were long dead at the time. I happen to be of that mindset that believe that they could not have possibly written from eyewitness accounts because the timing just doesn't add up. It just doesn't jive. Let's talk about when you're talking about the general question of who wrote the Bible. A big part of the Bible, particularly the New Testament, is the Gospels. So, can we get into Mike a little bit about the Gospels? Let me just give everybody kind of a heads up here, and it's really simple. Beginning around 70 A.D., about 4 decades or so after Jesus' crucifixion, 4 anonymously written chronicles of his life emerged, and that will become central documents in the Christian faith. The names for Jesus' most devoted earthly disciples: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The 4 canonical Gospels were traditionally thought to be written as eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. For more than a century, scholars have generally agreed that the Gospels, like many of the books in the New Testament, were not actually written by the people whom they are attributed to. And there, Mike Lynch, is where I want to begin with you. Why do people, again, the traditionalists, the literalists, why do they insist on making the argument that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John when clearly the timing could not have been possible time-wise?
Well, I would politely disagree with that.
Okay. Go ahead.
So the church starts around 30 A.D. when Jesus dies, and then
Right.
we have in the book of Acts, you have Pentecost, which happens 50 days after these events of Jesus's life happen, and that's what's known as the birth of the church. In Acts chapter 2, the disciples are gathered together. There's about 130 or so people in this room, and then the Holy Spirit comes upon them, and then they go out and start preaching. And Peter, being the sort of the head of the apostles, preaches, and it says that 3,000 came to faith, and that's the birth of the church. And then the rest of the book of Acts shows the growth of the church over the next 10 years or so. Paul becomes, in chapter 8 of Acts, becomes a convert to Christianity. He was a Pharisee. He was a Jewish leader. Was arresting Christians and throwing them in jail, and in some cases having them killed. He was an enemy of the church. And then Jesus, according to the Acts chapter 8, appears to Paul, and he converts to Christianity, and he becomes the leading evangelist for the church. And he goes into Europe and Rome and other places, and really causes the church to expand very quickly because of Paul's evangelistic efforts.
Yeah.
Now, when Paul was starting churches in the 40s and 50s, and later, and he died, he's believed to have died in Rome around 67 AD under Nero, about the same time as Peter. Paul writes his epistles, his letters to the different churches that he had started. He would start a church in a certain area, like at Ephesus or in Corinth or other places. And then he would write letters to either see how they're doing or just to correct some problems that they were having, to kind of help them kind of get back on track again. And those were happening, in, like I said, into the 40s and 50s primarily. Well, the Gospels, I believe, don't start appearing until the 60s. Because what's starting to happen is, this is approximately 30 years after Jesus' death, and this is when the eyewitnesses are starting to die off. They're not, it's like World War II vets today. You want to get their stories because most of them are in their late 90s, early 100s, and you want to get their stories before they're gone, because then they're going to be gone forever.
Right.
So you have the 4 different writers of the Gospels during this time.
Well, that was going to be one of my questions for you, and I'm glad you went right there. And forgive me for interrupting, because it's absolutely critical. You're exactly where I am right now. on this little thing I got here, and I'll tell you what this is in a minute. But one of the things that I wanted to find out is with regard to particularly Paul. He's generally regarded as the one who wrote the epistles, all the letters, all and he wrote a lot. He was in jail, but he wrote a lot from jail.
Yes.
So Paul was a rebel rouser. People don't realize he was in trouble all the time.
Yes.
Kind of like the Mad Dog. He was the Mad Dog of his day. But here's what we know. Traditionally, 13 of the 27 books of the New Testament were attributed to Paul, who famously converted to Christianity after meeting Jesus on the road to Damascus. He was, by the way, called Saul at the time. If you don't know that story, check it. It's a great story. He wrote a series of letters that helped spread the faith throughout the Mediterranean. And scholars now agree, and this is where we might disagree, Mike, and maybe not. I don't know. Scholars now agree on the authenticity of only 7 of Paul's epistles: Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. They're believed to have been written between, I'll tell you right now, between AD 50 and 60, making them the earliest known evidence for Christianity. Authors of the latter epistles may have been followers of Paul who used his name to lend authenticity to his works. Your thoughts on that claim?
Yeah, and that's happens in a lot of cases. Like you talked before, the epistle of Mary, that it was the mother of Jesus that wrote this epistle. And in the 200s and the 300s, again, when Gnosticism was a movement that was really clashing with traditional Christian theology, they would attach names to something to give it weight. Or the Gospel of Thomas, like Thomas was one of, doubting Thomas, one of the apostles. So if you're a writer in the 200s and you say, well, Thomas wrote this, that's going to give it weight and should be considered canon. And that was a very, very common practice at the time. And so that's why, trying to discern who wrote what was very important, because did this person really write this, or did they claim to, or is somebody making the assertion that it was written by an eyewitness of Jesus and his ministry? So, and that's one of the criteria for the New Testament of, why is it important that the eyewitnesses wrote the New Testament? Well, that was what the church determined to be one of the deciding, it wasn't the only one, but it was one of the deciding factors. Yeah. That if Paul wrote something, or if John wrote a gospel, or James, the brother of Jesus, wrote the epistle of James. Obviously, he was an eyewitness. They were there at the time. They saw and heard, and even John, when he writes his gospel, saying, I saw him, we held him, we were with him. We saw him when he was hungry and thirsty and he was tired. I experienced all these things for 3 years when Jesus did his ministry, versus someone who wrote in 250 AD who claims to have been an eyewitness, but there are 150 years beyond these historical events. Which one is more authentic?
Well, that's therein is my point. Amelia, jump in.
Right, just like the I hear a lot of people say, like, Noah's Ark, was that a real story? Was that really even written? How could it have gotten all the animals in that boat as well? Too. I mean, that story still a lot of people say.
Amelia, you just went off the rails, girlfriend.
I mean, a lot of stories
Where
like that.
did you go off the rails? Hold on, Mike. I'll bring this back in. Hold on.
Well, you know what I mean. And then, like, a lot of people, they say that we have the beginning of the book, right? We have the beginning of time, and then now we're probably living close to the end of times. Do you think that's coming true as well?
Well, there are many people that claim that these are the quote unquote end times. In the 1970s, there was a famous writer, Hal Lindsey. If you're familiar with Hal Lindsey,
I'm very familiar with Hal Lindsey. Absolutely.
And he wrote Countdown to Armageddon. So he believed in the 1980s, like this is it, where it's happening, at any instant of time. Well, that didn't happen. Or in 1988, Edgar Weisnant wrote 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Take Place in 1988. Well, that didn't happen either.
Well, you know what? In fairness, Mike, let's just let's be honest about it. In fairness, people have been saying we're in the end times since the beginning of time. Let's just call it what it is.
Well, when Peter wrote, I can't remember if it was the first epistle or the second epistle. I think it was the second one.
Right.
When he says, that basically there was a belief in the church in the 60s that Jesus was imminently coming back within their lifetime. And Peter says, God is not slow about keeping his promises. He's trying to reassure the church because they're saying, you said he was coming back. Where is he? And they're starting to lose their faith. They're starting to lose their hope that what they were saying was true. And he's saying, well, to God, a day is like 1,000 years and 1,000 years is a day. God sees time very differently than we do.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So yes,
even the
don't
apostles understand that.
Even Peter believed it was happening within his time, and he had to reassure the church that it could happen when God decides it happens.
Amelia.
Yes.
I stepped on your question. Go ahead. You can.
No, that's fine. I mean, because that was that was the question that I had, because a lot of people say that he maybe has come down to earth. We just don't know that he's been here visiting us a few times just to see how things are, because you don't know that person that's homeless asking for money could be him, seeing if we were going to help him. I believe in that.
Well, when Jesus said that when he referred to himself sometimes as the Son of Man, Jesus had a lot of different names, and that was one of his self-references. And he said, when you see the Son of Man coming, it'll be in glory.
Yes.
It's not because there have been claims that Jesus has already come back. I believe that's Jehovah's Witnesses theology that Jesus returned. I think it was in 1917, I believe, and that it already had taken place. I could be wrong about that, but I believe in 1917 there's a group that says that Jesus actually returned because there was a number of prophecies made, and when they finally said it happened.
That's true. It's absolutely true.
And I don't believe that to be true. It's supposed to be a spectacular event that no one will mistake. That's how Jesus describes his second coming in glory. Whatever, we don't know what that means, but it's everybody's going to see it at the same time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's going to be one of those things that, if you're unfortunate enough to say, I saw it happen, that means that you're still behind. Okay. So that's trouble for you. Am I right, Mike?
There's another reference that says that the heavens are going to be rolled back like a scroll. So again, using very strong visual language to say this is going to be unmistakable. It's not did this happen? Did I miss it? I don't know. I'm not sure. It's not going to be like that.
Let's talk about something. When we talk about literal translation or figurative, and then we're probably going to get into some of this tomorrow as well. But when we talk about, people, sometimes I let things get to me so much. And when I should just let it roll. But when it comes to this kind of stuff, I get a little animated, because I like to believe that my God is a God of his word, right? So let's talk about these so-called, promises God made, or the end time prophecy. I'm a big student and a fan of, and believe it or not, I can say that word. I'm a fan of the book of Revelation, because if you read the book as a Christian and I always tell people, if you're going to read the Bible, read the book of Revelations first. Read the Bible backwards, because guess what? We win. Okay.
Yeah.
And people don't get that when I say we win. What do you mean, Angelo? Christians win. God's team wins. Jesus carries the banner. People don't get that. It's simple stuff, folks. But my question, Mike, is when we're talking about, figurative and literal, can we talk about whether you believe, and this I'm going to ask you your personal opinion, whether you believe that there will be a literal, like some people believe, a literal end to the world, or does that simply, or do I read it the way I read it? Do I read it as transformation or evolution?
Well, one of the when people read Revelation, obviously it's a very difficult book to understand because there's a lot of visual symbolism. a dragon,
It
a
reads
beast,
like a movie, doesn't it, Mike?
Yeah, it's like a sci-fi movie. It's crazy,
It really is. There's a lot going on in Revelation. A lot.
and John trying to
Physical.
describe what he's seeing is using all
Yeah.
this visual language of metaphor, and it's like, what does he mean by this? And that's why there's so many different interpretations, because
Yeah.
it's not like the Gospels where it's showing, well, Jesus went here and Jesus did this and he performed this miracle. It's
Right.
easy to understand, it's easy to follow, but Revelation is very hard to follow. But generally, you get general ideas that there's going to be this time of tribulation, that the world is going to go through terrible, one crisis after another, that's going to be global, a lot of catastrophes. And then the Antichrist / beast shows up and declares himself God, and pulls people away from worshiping God to worship himself, whoever this person is, who's going to have supernatural power of some kind. And he's going to be a very charismatic person that can sway people his way. And there's going to be there's no Armageddon that takes place where there's this climactic battle, but we're poised to have this battle until God intervenes. And then, like you said, that the earth is in pretty bad shape by the time God intervenes. And then later on, I believe it's in chapter 22 of Revelation, it talks about how there's a new heaven and a new earth, that God is going to transform the world and make it back like it was in Eden. That in the center, it says that the sun is not needed anymore, because God's presence is going to be light, and everyone, the light of the world is going to be through God. And there's going to be a tree in the middle of Jerusalem. Again, going back to the language of Eden and Genesis. So yes, it's going to get bad, and then it gets really good, and then we're going to be with him forever, living in paradise with God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit, and all. John says he saw millions upon millions of people, more than he could ever count. Those are all the people that are going to be with God for all time, for all eternity.
And let us talk about that. We got a lot to talk about, brother. But we got a couple nights to do it, because you're going to be with. Let me just ask you right now, while I have you here, can you join me Wednesday night, Mike?
To discuss what specifically?
We're going to continue this discussion.
Sure. I think I can be here on Wednesday.
Fabulous. I will take care of that. I will make sure Amelia. In fact, you know what? I'm going to give it to you myself. I will give you I'll send a link to your email. Because we have 3 nights of this kind of topic, and I wanted this to happen. Well, I'll tell you what, I know God's always listening. So Lord, and I know you can hear me. I know you always do. Sometimes I don't listen to you, but you still listen to me.
All right.
I would love to be around. I mean this. I would love to. I know it's going to be a scary time to live through, but I would love to be around for that day when we get to hang out with Jesus in peace and harmony, and don't have to worry about trampling through bodies and stepping in guts. I mean, let's just call it is, because it's going to be nasty.
Yes,
it's going to be bad. I mean, people don't understand bad.
Yeah, it's going to be. If Revelation is correct, it's going to be not pleasant. It's going to last several years until the end happens.
Well, it talks about a 7-year, with the word tribulation. It talks about and almost an even split too. The first 3.5, and then the second 3.5 being like unbelievably unbearable.
Right. They're known as the bowls of wrath in Revelation.
Yeah.
God pours out his wrath because of all the sins and rejection of him in humanity. And he does this. It's sort of like when Jesus was doing his ministry, when he goes to the woman at the well. I mean, she's a prostitute. She's been divorced. She's living with this guy. She's an outcast in her community. That's why she's getting the water in the heat of the day. She's getting her water because everyone else got their water when it was cool in the morning, and she had to wait until they're done because no one would talk to her. Nobody would associate. And Jesus is very compassionate towards her. He's very kind to her.
Yeah.
And because she's in such pain, and she's feeling isolated and rejected, and he's very, very soothing with her, and he brings healing into her life. Yeah. Whereas when he talks to the Pharisees, he's very harsh with them. He's very confrontational with them because they have hypocrisy in their life. They have self-righteousness in their life. And they think we are holy, righteous men. We don't need anything. And Jesus is saying, you need more than you think you do. And he's got to use a fist to try to get to them through their kind of their hard shell.
Yeah.
Well, Revelation talks about the same thing, that why does God is so wrathful in Revelation is because humanity is so far away from God and his truth that he has to use very difficult circumstances to get people to turn toward him, because they won't do it on their own.
And that's where we are these days. We are exactly there these days. The world, ladies and gentlemen, in case you don't live in this world, the world is upside down. Bad is good, good is bad, up is down, east is west, west is east. It's all, everything that you thought you knew, throw it out the window because it don't exist anymore. It's anarchy. It's wait a minute. And it's going, you think this is bad?
Oh boy.
You haven't seen squat yet, okay? You haven't seen anything. Mike Lynch is going to be with us tomorrow night, and thankfully will be with us Wednesday. So now I can take tomorrow night, and this will be our question. Was Jesus a real person? We will talk about that tomorrow. And Wednesday, Mike will join us, and the question will be, does God exist? That's going to be the question. Because, boy, I'll tell you what, you need a show just for that topic.
Yes.
Can science prove the existence of God? We will find out. But, Mike, I'll tell you what, brother, we have to let you go tonight. Amelia, what do we got coming up?
Well, next week is nothing going to be but our little sessions that we just talk about anything and everything.
But we call them BS sessions.
Yes, BS sessions.
We're going to have 3 nights of rampant BS from the Mad Dog and the Pitbull.
Yeah, make it easy for you because you go on vacation a week after that.
I want to extend my gratitude to Mike, and I want to tell you, Mike Lynch, you are an amazing writer. His book, by the way, check it out. It's Ken Widener and Mike Lynch. The book is called Alcatraz, The Last Escape. Mike, what else do you have out publication-wise that people can read?
Oh, I have a number of books that have come out over the years. They can just find my name on Amazon, Mike Lynch, and then they'll find all the books. It's there's too many to mention.
Lynch, ladies and gentlemen, Mike Lynch, author Mike Lynch, friend of mine, Mike Lynch, good guy, Mike Lynch. Smart guy too.
A lot of people have been requesting.
That's saying something. You kidding me?
A lot of people have been requesting his show. So please go on our YouTube channel and watch it as well. So
absolutely,
show. Yes,
absolutely. Okay, on behalf of Amelia the Pitbull Chapman, Michael Mad Dog Lynch. I'm going to call you the Mad Dog now.
Okay, sure.
I am Angelo Mad Dog, the Mad Dog Brothers. That's what we are. We will be here tomorrow night, Lord willing, and the creek don't rise, with Mike Lynch, Amelia Chapman, and yours truly. I am the Mad Dog. We'll see you. God bless you, ladies and gentlemen, and be safe out there. Bye-bye.